things are working out. Basically, we were able to secure the application with the help of Spring Security, and then we were able to log in as well. But the only thing is, we are able to log in with the help of this username and password. What I want to achieve is, I want this data to be coming from database, because we can have multiple username and password. And even if Spring Security says, hey, let me give you an option of having more users here, don't you think we are hard-coding the values? In the real world, we don't do that. So we want to store this data in database and fetch it from database to verify the user. That should make much more sense. But if you want to do that, there are multiple steps involved and a lot of steps. And that's why if you can see the video is lengthy. The thing is, when you build applications, huge applications, which will go for months or years, the setup like Spring Security and database connections will hardly take 1 or 2 days, or maybe more, depending upon the complexity of your project. But then you do that only once, not for the entire time of the project. You do this setting once and you just use it. In the remaining time, which is a lot of time, you focus on building a feature, right? Whatever logic, business logic you want to implement. So in this video, let's do that initial part of work of securing the application, and let's see how that works. Again, video is a bit lengthy, so just bear with me, and I will do step by step. So make sure that you practice when you are watching this so that it will make much more sense. Okay, so let's go back to the security config. Now, what is happening is, whenever you log in, of course, Spring Security is using the application properties to verify the username and password, but who is working behind the scene? If you remember, we have talked about different filters. In fact, we have asked our Copilot as well, what are different filters we have. One of the filter, which is username password authentication filter. Now that filter is responsible to verify or to take the username password and get it verified. And who is responsible to do that? So somewhere in between, we have something called a user details service. See, in the application, when you talk about different layers, like web application, we have different layers, right? We got controller, we got service, we got repo layer. And when a client sends a request goes to the controller says, okay, my job is to only accept the request and respond. But if you want to do any processing, that will be done in the service layer. What if you want to do some database connection? That's where you have repository layer, right? Now, here, to verify the username password, we can use something called a user details service. Now, by default, it was getting used, but I want to customize it. I don't want it to use the application properties. I want it to verify the way I want. And how do we do that? It's very simple. You can ask, hey, don't use the default one, use mine, which I'm giving you. But how you will give it something to the Spring Security. And that's where what we can do is we can create a bean. Because when you create a bean will be there in the Spring container, and your Spring Security will pick it from there. So what bean I want to create? I want to create a bean of user details service. This is an inbuilt thing inside the Spring Security. And I will say user details service. What I want to do is just return this object. My job is done, right? So it will behave the way I want. I'm happy. But then how will you create the object of it? First of all, let's verify the package for this. So if you see here, the package is springframeworks.security.core.userdetails.userdetailsservice. And now I just have to return the object of it. How difficult that can be? I can simply say return new user details service. Okay, but the syntax is a bit different. We are getting curly brackets as well. What is user details service? If I click on this, oh, it's an interface. I was not expecting interface. The thing is, if you have interface, you can't create the object of it. Then we have to go for a long way. What is a long way? Either we have to get the implementation of it, or we can use some inbuilt implementations. We have to create a class which implements this, but we'll do that later. At this point, let's go step by step and use something which is inbuilt. So I'm going to use a class which implements user details service, and that is in-memory user details manager. Okay, how do I verify that this class implements the user details service? You can click on this, and this is a constructor. If you go up, it's a class. That's a good thing. That means we can create the object. And this implements user details manager. Okay. If I click on this extends user details service. So our job is done. So indirectly, in memory, user details manager is implementing user details service. Okay, is our job done here? Not exactly. We are simply returning an empty object, right? Or the object which is not having any value. So it will work and it will not work. It will work because it will run. It will not work is because if you provide the username password, how it will verify. I want to show you something, and I'm expecting it will work the way I want. Let's see. I'm going to enter the same username password when I'm logged in, or when I'm trying to log in, and let's see if that works. So the username is Naveen, password is Telusko. And if I go back to, I will try with Postman, at least you can see the username password there, right? I can go to authorization. You can see the username password is Naveen and Telusko. I'm going to try to hit students, let's say, not the get request, or sorry, not the post request, but the get request for the students. And let's verify the authorization once again. It's Naveen and Telusko. Enter. You can say it failed, 401 unauthorized. So why it's not working is because now we are not using default service. We are basically returning our own user details service object. And if you want to do that, you have to customize this. Now, how will you do that? Now, if you look at the constructor of in-memory user details service, there are multiple constructors. Let's go to it in this. You can see it has a constructor which is empty. It also has a constructor which takes the collections of users, okay? And we got one more which takes a varargs. Basically, we can pass different user objects by giving commas, or user details objects by giving commas. Let's use this. So what I want to do is I want to return different objects or different users. How will I do that? It's very simple. You come back here. And if you remember, it was taking the object of user details. So let's create the object of user details. And if you see user details, oh, even this is interface. Okay, a lot of interface to deal with. That means we have to get a class for this to implement. Not exactly, I will show you something. So we'll say user details, I will say user1 is equal to, let's use a class called user. So there's inbuilt user in the Spring framework. And if I click on user, it is a class. And this implements user details. And it got a lot of methods. One of the methods which we are going to use is the builder. So we are going to use the builder. Okay. So to achieve that, what we can do is we can say user, since it's a builder Python, I will say enter and dot, dot, dot. The first thing I want to assign is the password encoder. See, the thing is, whenever you store data in database or whatever data you are saving, by default, we store that in a plain text. What I want to do here is, let's say if I want to store the username, and if I store that in a plain text, that's fine. But if you want to store a password, it's a plain text, anyone can read it. Not a good idea, right? So you should do encoding of your password so that no one can read it. So at this point, I don't want to make it complex. So I will just go with the default password encoder. So I will say with default password encoder. And this is deprecated, don't use it. I'm just showing you so that since we are learning into learning phase, I can show you anything. But don't use it in production. Next, I want to assign is a username. So let's say the first user is Kiran. Let's not use Naveen now because we have used it before. So let's use Kiran. The password I want to mention is k@123. Then I also want to assign the roles. Again, it is optional, but let's say I want to assign a role. So Kiran is user here. And the password, then once it is done, so we got the username, password, and role, I can simply say build. Now by doing this build, we can build this particular object. And this build, so not the builder, I think I have talked about builder or build. Okay, it doesn't matter. So this build returns the object of user details. And that's what we wanted, right? So we got our first user. We can create more users if I want. Otherwise, I can simply pass this user1, and our job is done. But let's say if I want to pass one more, just for the experiment, this is user2. And let's say Harsh is h@123. And let's say Harsh is an admin. So we can create different roles, maybe user, admin, trainer, or anything you want. Anyway, and then I can pass different users here, not just one, multiple. Now, since it supports varargs, you can pass any number of users just by giving comma. Okay, still till this point, we have not connected with database. Okay, we are still trying to understand how do we customize stuff. Okay, let's see if this works. Let's restart the application. We can use browser, or maybe I will just try to do that with the Postman. This time I will go for Naveen and Telusko. It should not work. And if I use Kiran and the password is k@123, I could have used browser, but then on browser, you can't see the password. I want you to see the password. If I click on send, it says okay. So this is working. If I give a wrong password, of course, this should not work. Let's try with Harsh as well. And Harsh is h@123. Let's say in 1234, it should not work. And 123, it should work, and it's working. So that's how basically you can customize or you can have different users. But again, not a good idea still. It's because we are still using the hard-coded values in the code. I want this to be coming from database. In that case, we can't use this. Is because this thing is actually returning the default one. So comment. Okay, next step. Now we want to work with database. How do I do that? See, if you want to work with database, we have to understand one more concept. See, whenever you pass the details, username and password in the login form, that object, when your server receives it, it's basically an authentication object, which is still not authenticated. It goes to something called authentication provider, who will basically provide the service of checking it and validating it and then make it as an authentication object. By default, it's running behind the scene, but now I want to customize it because this time I don't want to use a default authentication provider. I want to use mine. And that authentication provider can be used to connect with database, to some LDAP service or some other service. And for database, we have a different authentication provider, and let's use that. So basically what I'm trying to say is, let's create a bean to change our authentication provider itself altogether. And I'm not going to use the default one, so let's create our own. So public authentication provider, and I will say authentication provider, there's a method name. And let's return the object of authentication provider. How difficult it can be. We can simply create the object and return. If I click on authentication provider, it's back. So interface is back. It's an interface. So that means we have to look for a class which implements authentication provider. As I mentioned before, there are multiple authentication providers, right? One of them is for database, and that is called a DAO authentication provider. So let's use that. So DAO authentication provider. And if you see, this is a class, a relief, okay? And okay, so it actually extends abstract user details authentication provider. If I click on this, it implements authentication provider. So indirectly it is implementing it, and we should be happy with it. Let me close all the extra files which is open here. Even this. And let's say this is a provider equal to new DAO authentication provider, and simply return this. Our job is done, right? Actually not. Now what's wrong with this? See, this will return the object for sure. Okay, this should return the object. But the problem is, this one basically need to connect with database and get the data. And at this point, we don't even have the database. We don't even have, I mean, we have not specified who is our DBMS. We are going to use Postgres, by the way. It has no idea what is your table name, database name, nothing we have mentioned. And that thing we have to do first. So we'll do that sometime. But if you want to specify those things, what we have to do is, we have to go to provider. The first thing you have to mention is, I want to use a password encoder, which is the default password encoder, which is no op password encoder dot get instance. So what we are doing is, we are not using any password encoder. You can use that. I will show you that later. How do we use some different password encoders? At this point, I'm saying there's no password encoder, default one. So you will see the plain text. Next, I want to specify before returning this object is the user details service. If you remember, at the start also I mentioned that behind the scene, user details service works, and that is responsible to verify it. And now I'm saying that I want to even change the authentication provider. It will also use the user details service. We have to specify that. So I will create my own user details service, not the bean which we created, but somewhere here. I want it to inject the object. I want Spring to inject this object at AutoWired. But unfortunately, even Spring will have no idea how do we provide this, or maybe Spring will provide a default one. I don't want default one. I want to customize it. I want to have my own user details service. Okay, how do we create our own user details service? It's very easy, right? This is the interface. The only thing we have to do is create a class. That will make our job easy, right? Okay, so let's create a class called user details service, or maybe some other name which implements user details service. And before I do that, I just want to make some changes. I want to get different packages. We are not keeping things in a proper package. So I will say controller package. We already got config. So we got controller. I want to have a service package. I want to have a repo package. I want to have a model package. Okay, so the reason I'm doing this is because the controller should be a part of a controller, right? The home controller should be part of hello controller. The student controller should be part of the controller package. The student, which is a model, should be part of a model. And that's it. Now in this service, basically I want to create a class which implements the user details service. And I will say my user details service. I can also say Telusko user details service. but that's fine. And this implements user details service. As simple as that. The only thing you have to do is, first of all, let's mark it as a service. Second, I want to, you can see we got an error here. It's because in user details service, we got a method. We have to implement this method, which is load user by username. So, okay, it's simple. You can just come back here and say implement the methods, which is load user by username, and do something. Okay, I'm not sure what to do. It just said load user by username. This is tricky. How will I load the user by username? And from where I have to load it? See, that's where we have to think about layers. Now, we have a service, right? And service says, I want to get some data, and data should be coming from database. And who is that layer who will give you the data? It's your repo, right? So that means if you want this to fetch the data, we need a repo layer. So I can simply go back here and create, in the repo, I can create a class. It's actually an interface, because if you remember, we have talked about JPA. In JPA, you define the interface for the repo, and it will give you all the methods. So I will say this, not student, what you are working with. So I will say user repo, and this repo will extend the JPA repository. The thing it is not working is because we have not added the dependencies. See, till this point, the project is still a simple web application, right? Nowhere we have talked about the JPA, nowhere we have talked about database. So that means if you want that dependency, we have to add two dependencies, one for the JPA and one for the Postgres. Now, as your DBMS changes, you can use different DBMS driver here. So I will go back here and I want some dependencies. To achieve that, I will go back to my browser and I will go to MVN repository. And here, I will search for Spring Boot JPA. The first one. Which version? Anyway, we are going to remove the version, so anything you pick up that works. And just copy this, not the entire stuff. It also promotes their own website. It's a good thing, but I want to keep it clean. I don't want to specify the version because that's something we have specified up here. If you can see, yeah, we have specified the version in the parent. So we don't have to specify that here. Okay, that's one. The next dependency I want is for Postgres. Now, depending upon which DBMS you use, you can change it. So let's say if I want to use Postgres SQL DDBC, this is a driver. If you want to use MySQL, search for MySQL driver. And from this, I will pick up the one which is not vulnerable, which is this one. Again, it might be vulnerable. It's just that they have not tested it properly. So I can just copy this and paste it here. So we got two dependencies. And once you add them, you just have to reload your Maven. So it will download dependency for you. Okay, I think dependency added. Let's go back to the repo, the user repo. And let's see if you can get the dependency now. So we'll just cut this, control space. Yeah, now I got it. So it says JPA repository. We have to pass two things. One is the class which will refer to the table. I will explain that in some time. And the primary key. So the primary key is integer. Now, in fact, you don't even need the primary key as an integer. Okay, we'll see that. So what we can do is, when you talk about JPA repository or the concept of data JPA, you define a model class. So for a table, so of course in your database you'll be having a table. In fact, let's do that. Let's do step by step. It will make much more sense. Now, since I'm using Postgres, you can use any DBMS which you want. I'm going to use Postgres. Okay. And to do that, I will open my pgadmin. So in this machine, I already have Postgres, already have pgadmin installed. So make sure that you download Postgres, get pgadmin. If you want a shortcut way, you can just go to Postgres download. For Mac, they have done something new. Not sure about Linux or Windows. So you can get something called postgres.app. I'm not sure if this works on Windows, but for Mac, we have this. For Windows, anyway, the setup is very easy for Postgres. For Mac, you can just get this and run it. It will work. By default, the username will be your system username and your password will be blank. So you can use that. So it depends upon how you configure this. So I got my pgadmin open. I will explore the databases. In this, I got Telusko database. I'm going to use the same one. And if you see there are different tables here, let's ignore all. In fact, there's also user. Okay, let's not use Telusko database. Let's create our own. So I will click on database. I will say create a database and let's name it Telusko 1. Not a good name for database, but that works. Click on save. So now we got different database. And in this, if you say schema, we don't have any table. You can see it's empty. So now let's create a table here. So I can just open the query tool here and say create table. So create table users. In fact, you can also get this done from the code itself using JPA, but I want to show you, let's say if you already have a table, how do you make it work? So we got table, and let's say we have 3 values, username and password. So the type of ID should be integer, and this should also be primary key. The username is text. The password is also text. And let's execute this. So what this will do is this will basically create a table for you. And now let's see if you have data. So I will say select star from users and run this. It's empty. Let's insert some data. So I will say insert into users, values. I want to insert 1. That's my ID. Then I have to enter username, which is, let's say, Naveen. And the password is, let's say, n@123. I want to have one more user. Let's go with 2 users. So it's a 2, not double quotes, single quotes, Sushil. And the password is s@123. So we got 2 users, and I will simply execute this line. Okay, I think it executes both the lines. Okay, so select and run works. So you can see we got the data here. And now I want to basically connect them. So we got table, right? Now in JPA, when you want to connect your table with the code, basically what you do is you create a class which represents it. So let's go back here. So we need a class like user which connects with your table, and the user class should represent the users table. The reason I went for users in Postgres is because I think user table is already there for the Postgres inbuilt implementation, so it doesn't allow. You can just check and let me know in the comments. But here I'm using user, or maybe we should create users, even that makes sense. So let's create this class. We don't have this class users. And where will you do this? You will do that in the model. So in the model, I will right click, I will say new class, and I will name this as users. So what are the things we need here? First of all, we need to basically represent your table and a class, right? So I will say primary int ID, primary string username, and private string, did I say primary before? Ignore. I will say password. And in this, I will say @ID because that's my primary key. And I'm assuming that you know JP, okay? I'm not teaching you JP here. So I will say entity, and that's done. Our job is done here. But we need getter setters for this. So I will say generate getter setters for all 3 variables. And maybe in future, if you want to print it, you will also use the toString for all the variables. Okay, it says one problem. What is that one problem? Okay, we have to import the package. That's the problem? Don't tell me. Okay, that's it. Looks like our job is done. Is it? Let's see. Let's go back here. And now, since I already have a user repo, now we have a power to connect with database. I'm so happy. No, actually, we don't have a power. It's because even if your user repo says it is connecting, nowhere in the application we have specified which DBMS you are working with. What is your username for that DBMS? What's your password? Let's configure that first. And we will do that in the application properties. So here, basically, we have to specify different properties. One is Spring Data Source .url, and we have to specify the URL for JDBC, which is JDBC:PostgreSQL. Now, depending upon which DBMS you're using, if you're using MySQL, replace MySQL there, //localhost, this remains same, then you have to specify the port number for the DBMS. Now, since we are using Postgres, the port number is 5432. For MySQL, it is 3306. Depending upon which DBMS you use, just change the port number, change the name here, and then / your database name, Telusko1. Next, we have to mention the username. So data source .username is equal to, I think it is Postgres for my machine, and the password. So spring.datasource.password, and the password for this machine is 0000. Okay, so now we have specified which DBMS you're working with. We have specified the username and password. They should work, but it will not. The reason, I mentioned that we have a lot of things to do. So just bear with me. This is looking good. Let's go back to the my user detail services because we are still returning null. We don't want to return null. What we want to do is, we want this to connect with the user repo. So I will say private user repo, and I will say this is auto-wired. And for the repo, I have to mention that this is the repository. Okay. And now, basically, with the help of this repo, I can fetch. Now, what do you fetch? If you see the method name is load user by username, that means we are getting username here. We just have to verify if the user exists in the database. So I can say users, user1, or maybe a user is equal to, I can say repo dot. Now in the repo, we have a lot of methods, right? We got find by ID and all those stuff, but then now we don't have to find by ID, we have to find by the username. So I have to say find by username and just pass the username, right? And in the repo, we can use DSL and we can say users find by username and we can specify the username. So now basically we got this method and this will return the user. And we just have to check if the user is there. We can say if the user is equal to null, in that case, I want to print on the console as well. First of all, let's print on the console that the user not found. Okay, how will you let your system know that the user not found? If you observe, this particular method returns user not found exception. What if you can just throw it? So here you can say throw new user not found exception with the same message, user not found. It's that simple. But what if you found the user? In that case, what you will return? It's very simple. In that case, you will return the object of user details. Okay, and if you see, the video is still not completed. We still have to work with the user details. Okay, now if you click on user details, I can simply create the object of user details, right? You can say new user details, but unfortunately, user details is an interface. You can see I here. That means we have to look for a class which implements this, or we have to create our own class. And the idea is create your own class. So many classes, right? But as I mentioned, this is just one-time setup. Okay, so let's go back to your model and let's create the user details, or maybe you can call it something else. You can say my user details, or you can say user principal. So normally in the terms of Spring Security, the user principals refer to the current user who is trying to access or who is trying to log in. And that's a user we are checking, right? So instead of saying my user details, you can say user principal. But user principals implement the user details. That's what we are trying to implement. And if you see the list of methods we have to implement, let's go back here. And if you click on user details, look at the methods. So many methods to implement. Okay, we don't have a choice. So I will just go back here and say implement the methods, all the methods. So we got all the methods here. Okay, now is it difficult to implement all? See, when you're building a full-fledged application, yes, you have to mention everything. But in this example, I'm going to skip certain things. Example, you can see we have different methods which returns Boolean. Example, is it enabled? We have to return something. At this point, I'm assuming that the account is enabled, so I will say true. Is credentials not expired? True, it's not expired yet. Is account non-locked? Yes, it is not locked. Of course, in the big application, you have to take care of all those stuff. Is account not expired? No. True. Get username? I can't say true now because we have to actually return the username. We have to actually return the password, and we have to actually return the authorities, the roles. We can even skip roles if you want, but let's try to implement that. But the question is, if I'm creating this class, which is user principals, or which is implementing user details, how will I return these values? I don't have these values. You don't have it. But from the class where you want to access this has these values. You can see in users, we have these values. So the username and password is there. So what I can do is I can simply create the object of user principal, and we can pass this object. Our job is done, right? Once you pass it, you can accept it here, and then you can get the value. You just wanted the values, right? I can just right click here, say generate a constructor, which can take, okay, I could have written this by myself. I will say private users user, and let's pass users user, and this dot user is equal to user. So what we are doing is we are basically assigning this object which is coming from the constructor to the user. And once you got the hold on the object, I can just go back here. For the username, I can say user dot get username, password user dot get password. And for this collection, now we have to return the roles, right? Because one user can have multiple roles. And in the database, we are not even working with it. How do I handle this here? So maybe we can return some static values or null. So let's return the static values. I will say new, but it is asking you for the object type of granted authority. Okay, so I will return. So there's a class which implements this. So I will say simple granted authority, and I can pass the role as user. So by default, every user will be getting the access as user. Now the only thing is we can't return a single object. It is expecting a collection. Okay, so I will say collections dot. If you want to return only one object, there is a method called singleton. Let's use that. Okay, after talking for so long, I hope this will work. Let's try. Let's see if this works, and then I will explain. Let's go back to everything step by step. So let's restart the application and go back to the Postman. Let's see. We don't have Hirsch in database, do we? No. Click on send. You can see this is unauthorized. But what we have in database, let me verify the database fields once. So we got Naveen, or let's say we work with Sushil. And Sushil is username and password is s@123. So it is Sushil and it is S. Let's try with wrong password. Okay, unauthorized. Let's work with the right password. It worked. Okay. So after so long, things are working out. So data is coming from database. But still, we have one thing to do, which we'll do in the next video, which is we have not encrypted the password. So yeah, let's try with Naveen if Naveen is working. So Naveen, and it's n@123. So this is working. Let's go through the code once and understand what we have done. The first thing we are doing is we are making the changes. Okay, let's talk about the XML first. We have added two dependencies, one for JPA because we are working with database, and which database we are working with Postgres. That's one thing. Next, we have done some changes in the application properties. We have added the URL, username, and password. So the URL is this for Postgres, username for Postgres, and password for Postgres. Then we have to basically configure this security config. By default, it was using some authentication provider. We are saying, let me provide authentication provider, which is the DAO authentication provider. To make it work, you have to pass two things. First, password encoder. And second, the user details service, our own user details service. And since we want our own, we have to create our own class, which we are doing here. And this says, okay, you can create this class. You just have to implement one method, which is load user by username. To make it work, we need to work with the repo because repo will do the database connectivity. If it is connected, you got the data, it's good. You say return the data or return the object. If not, you can print user not found. In fact, when I was testing it, we also got a message here. You can see user not found. Okay, so you can do this, but then you can't simply return this user service, user principal, is because we have to implement the user details interface there, which has so many methods. We just have concerned about the username, password, and the authorities. So that's all in the code. Make sure that you check the code. Okay, you will find the link in description. And do that once. Do this code by yourself, then it will make sense. I know there are a lot of files to work with, and we have spent enough time to understand this. So yeah, that's it from this video. I hope to see you in the next video. I hope you're enjoying. Do let me know in the comments. Bye-bye.